Professor and Director of the Integrative Medicine Program at the MD Anderson Cancer Center, and also Distinguished Clinical Professor at Fudan University Cancer Hospital, Shanghai, China. He is a founding member and on the Executive Committee of the International Society for Integrative Oncology. Dr. Cohen is currently conducting clinical trials examining the biobehavioral effects of psychosocial interventions aimed at reducing the negative aspects of cancer treatment and improving the quality of life. His research simultaneously accesses psychological, behavioral, and physiological factors in an attempt to better understand the cancer process. Please welcome Dr. Cohen.
Thank you. I'm starting to lose my voice because I've been speaking to so many wonderful people who I've met tonight. I'm so thankful to Linda and Rose for putting this event on our behalf, and of course on everyone in the room's behalf, and in reality for everyone in our world, because I believe what we're embarking on here at MD Anderson, as James so eloquently outlined, is truly a landmark study. And I'll walk us through in this brief period of time some of the evidence why this is, I believe, going to be truly a landmark study. You've heard some of these horrendous statistics that 1 in 2 men, 1 in 3 women are going to be diagnosed with cancer. This year, the World Health Organization estimates that cancer is going to be the #1 killer worldwide. This is a brand new phenomenon. The #1 killer up until now has been cardiovascular disease, and now it's going to be cancer. And this is something that is changing and continuing. So it is so critical that a change happens in this trajectory that we see happening now. So James outlined a little bit who MD Anderson is. Most people hadn't heard of MD Anderson. I had never heard of MD Anderson before making the decision to go down there. But when I learned about MD Anderson, we quickly find out that is really unsurpassed, arguably in the world, except for Memorial Sloan Kettering. And you know, numbers and statistics don't mean a lot, but of course we look at them and we rank them. And between us and Memorial Sloan Kettering, we're somewhat on par and close to each other. And you may notice that the next one down, a very good hospital, Johns Hopkins, gets a score of 66 out of 100. So the difference between these top 2 cancer centers and the next one down is just miles apart. And part of the reason is because we have a single focus on cancer. All our faculty focus on is cancer. There's over 18,000 employees at MD Anderson that just focus on cancer. And so this is a very unique hospital that has that kind of a focus. So there is some good news, which isn't talked about a lot, which we believe that up to 70% of cancer could be prevented in the first place if people made appropriate lifestyle and behavior choices. There's no debate that 30% of cancer could be eliminated from the world if people stopped smoking and using tobacco products. 30%. That's a huge number. Tens of millions of people every year diagnosed with cancer due to tobacco-related cause. Another 30% is estimated from inappropriate choices on diet. If you add in what we're learning about obesity, and I'll talk in a bit more detail about that, there is a huge relationship between obesity and cancer. And so in addition to diet, there's the whole issue of physical activity and the buzzword that's being called energy balance research. And then, of course, there's the environmental toxins and some of the things that we can't avoid, but some of the things that we can avoid in terms of what we bring into our households, what we put on our counters, what we expose ourselves and our children to. And David Servan Schreiber talked a little bit about that in terms of organic foods. So this book, Anti-Cancer, I get no money if somebody buys Anti-Cancer, so I'm not up here that I would personally profit from these statements. But this book is just a phenomenal book. And the reason it's so phenomenal is that you all met David, and it was wonderful to see David this evening amongst us on this screen. He is a brilliant physician, a brilliant scientist, MD, PhD, who, as you heard, at the peak of his career, was diagnosed with cancer. And he essentially ignored the cancer. He went and he got his conventional treatments, and then he went right back to work, and the hard driving, 12-hour, 18-hour days, and he has this picture of himself sitting at a table with a six-pack of Coca-Cola and the laptop open. And that was after his diagnosis and initial treatment, because he wasn't going to let anything stand in the way of his career. And then it's when he had the recurrence that he knew he had to do something more. And he started implementing these things that we'll talk about. And his colleagues told him that he needs to put this information in a book. He went to the literature as a scientist and a physician and learned what he should be doing, because nobody was telling him, besides chemo, radiation, surgery, about what he should be doing. And what he learned from the literature is in this book. As a scientist, I was reading the book and would always have a thumb in the footnotes to see what the articles were, what the titles of the studies were that he was talking about, and most importantly, where they were published. And the studies that he was citing are published in the top medical journals: Nature, Science, Journal of American Medical Association, The Lancet. He didn't have to dig deep in the literature of esoteric things, of alternative medicine, or of journals that are secondary or tertiary. This is evidence that is out there that just hasn't been put together. The scientists are very myopic in the way that we do our work, and we don't often talk to each other, and we're very competitive, and laboratories don't work together. And so people are working on this one piece here, and there's somebody else working on a different piece, and nobody's putting it together. And I actually learned about David Servan Schreiber from the president of MD Anderson, Dr. John Mendelsohn, who met him at the World Economic Summit in Davos, Switzerland a few years ago. And John Mendelsohn, who is arguably one of the most famous oncologists in the world, and who's discovered very important drugs that are useful in the battle on cancer, and developed these from the bench right to the bedside, was so convinced that what he heard from David is something that we needed to study and to implement at MD Anderson. He actually convinced me to hire David as an outside consultant and come onto our faculty. And so what I'll do is I'll walk you through a little bit of this book. I can't get into too much detail because of time issues, but just give you some of the highlights. As you saw in that slide, that it kept getting stuck on during the presentation, which is good, because now you all remember that slide, but you don't probably remember what was on that slide. What was on that slide were our immune cells, and the immune cells were scooting around, and on that slide was also cancer cells, and the cancer cells were literally being killed in real time by our immune system. We all carry cancer cells in us all the time. Our body is always undergoing problems and mutations, but it fixes itself. It can either do that by killing the cells with the immune system, or something called apoptosis, which is spontaneous cell death. So when there's a mutant cell and it's growing inappropriately, it should kill itself. A cell suicide, essentially. But when that doesn't happen, of course, then cancer can start to grow. And we are all constantly exposed to things that can make us more vulnerable to that cancer taking hold in the body and starting to grow. And as David mentioned, we know the statistics of how many people will get cancer, but we won't all die of cancer. And so there is these natural protective factors that exist within all of us. And the key is to make your body as inhospitable to cancer as possible. These are the statistics for the incidence of breast cancer in our society, dating back to World War II up to 2000. You could superimpose colon cancer, you could superimpose prostate cancer on this. This is an epidemic that is going on. Now, as part of this has to do with an aging population. So one of the biggest risk factors for cancer, unfortunately, is age. And as we age, the chance, of course, goes up. So this explains some part of this. Also, we're detecting cancer better because we are investing in detection techniques under the theory that if we can detect it sooner and treat it sooner, then there'll be less chance that it could actually kill you. And we can't get into all the details of the controversy there, but you've all read the controversies of mammograms and PSAs and the rest of it. And so maybe 30–40% of this increase could be attributed to that. But here's the graph for childhood cancers. And of course, age isn't a factor in childhood cancers because these are all children being diagnosed with cancer. This is an epidemic that's going on. There's no screening for childhood cancers. So this is something that is changing in our society. This is a distribution of breast cancer. Again, you could superimpose colon cancer, prostate cancer, the World Health Organization map of the incidence of breast cancer. And you can see that breast cancer is really a disease of the Western world and of Western lifestyle, because we have, of course, North America with the highest incidence. The countries in South America are Argentina and Chile, which really lead a Western lifestyle. You see Australia over there, Western Europe. And when the WHO went to China and were looking around rural villages and towns in China, they couldn't find a single case of breast cancer. It doesn't matter what the age, they couldn't find a single case of breast cancer in some of these towns. Now the #1 cancer in Shanghai in women is breast cancer. So the fact that there wasn't a single woman that they could find in some of these villages is just astounding. How many people in this room, put your hand up if you don't know anyone who's had breast cancer? A friend, a relative, anyone? There isn't a single hand going up. I mean, it's horrifying. This is what happens when women move from Shanghai, previous to this. This is 1989, so quite some time ago, to San Francisco. After one generation, their incidence of cancer becomes identical to Western women. This is the relationship between red meat intake and risk of colon cancer in terms of the per capita daily consumption per country. And so you see the countries on the far right with the highest incidence: Canada, USA, New Zealand. Then we have Japan, and I think it's Nigeria that are in the bottom corner. I mean, as you don't have to be a statistician to see that there's a straight line that goes through that. The higher your red meat intake, the higher your risk of colon cancer. This is some frightening statistics from doing these comparisons across countries, where here we see the incidence of colon cancer in India extremely low and consistently low across a decade of time. Here's the incidence in the USA, again, consistently high across decades over time. Here's the incidence of colon cancer in Japan. This is truly an epidemic of what's going on in Japan in this dramatic change. And there's other things that are going on in Asia. And there's obesity incidence that's going on in Japan that is partly due to this because of the change of the caloric intake, let alone the quality of the food. What David does so exceptionally well in this book is he pinpoints, as you saw on those cancer graphs, things that are really happening since World War II. the surge in cancer in the West has really happened since World War II. And he's gone to the literature and really pinpointed these 4 different areas as the key culprits. And so there's nutrition, which is primarily focusing on the sugar and the quantity of sugar that we eat and the types of fat that we're exposed to. Before World War II, not only was there not a lot of sugar consumption, but there wasn't the whole food industry that we know of today. There wasn't food science that exists today where you take these products that are natural and you modify them in these ways so that we can have a Twinkie on the shelf for 50 years. Now, we know that trans fats are a horrible product, and in the majority of places they have been outlawed, but that's only recently. And there was a report in the Netherlands that actually was submitted to the health organization there, showing that the deaths attributed to trans fats in a given year was actually higher than deaths attributed to motor vehicle accidents. And how much effort does our society go to help protect people from motor vehicle accidents? It's actually a law that you have to wear seatbelts. And absurd as it was, people fought that law originally because, you know, freedom of action. You can't tell me that I have to wear a seatbelt. I should be able to make that choice. We have stoplights. We have stop signs. We have laws that you can't go above a certain speed. But it's fine to fill our foods with trans fats that we know are contributing to heart disease and to early death. I'll get into some detail of some of the other things that are going on with fats, but processed foods are full of fats that cause inflammation, that cause diseases in our body, the majority of chronic diseases that we have been exposed to. Chemical exposure in our society happened starting in World War II. DDT didn't exist before World War II. There weren't these pesticides that we're putting on all our crops before World War II, let alone all the different things that are brought into our household. And sedentary behavior and physical activity, again, is something that's changed dramatically with the modern car world. And, you know, I don't have to say that to anyone who lives in Southern California, the amount of time that people spend in their cars. Kids don't walk to school anymore. Kids don't walk from the house to the park. It's always a transportation vehicle that has to get you there. And then the last area to which there's a lot of support, that there's been a dramatic change since 1945, is social support and our relations with others. On average, Americans move 5 times in their life. And at first, the move is deliberate away from the family and to try and get as far away from our families as we can when we go to college. But whenever you move, you disrupt the relationships, you disrupt, of course, that family structure that is so important when you encounter difficult situations in your life, to be able to help you deal with the stressors. And we'll touch on that area briefly. So this is a graph of the consumption of refined sugar per individual in the United States. Again, looking back quite some time, but we see something dramatic happening after World War II. And now the average consumption you see here for an individual is 70 kilograms of refined sugar a year. It's a staggering amount. I mean, you can't even, this is, you know, over 120 pounds of sugar. I mean, you just think of a 5-pound bag and how much sugar that must be. The food industry has gotten very creative at getting sugar into our bodies as much as they can and as often as they can, because it changes the way our brain works, and it's an addictive substance. And everyone knows the amount of sugar probably in Coca-Cola. If you were to put sugar in your coffee, how many little white bags of sugar do you think would be the amount where you would start to think this is sweet enough? Would it 1 bag or 2 bags? Maybe 3 or 4 at the extreme. A Coca-Cola has 12 packets of sugar in it. 12 packets of sugar. And our booth at the back actually has a very good example. They have an energy drink that doesn't have sugar in it, and they have all the statistics. Root beer, it turns out, actually has almost twice as much sugar in it as Coca-Cola. So imagine how much sugar that is. The other thing that the food industry, the FDA being very well-meaning, has said to the food industry, we need to educate everyone, so you have to put on the food label everything that's in it, and you have to list it in the quantity in which it's in that product. And what the food industry has done very creatively is they've manipulated sugar. So there isn't something that's just called sugar anymore. There's corn syrup, there's dextrose, there's maltose, there's brown sugar, there's cane sugar. There's all these other kinds of sugars. And so you go and you look at some of these processed foods, and you're not going to find one sugar in there. You're going to find 4 or 5 different sugars, and then therefore they're all very low on the ingredients list. But if you're to add up all those sugars, it's probably the second, and in some cases, like Captain Crunch and some of these cereals that are being fed into our children, it's the #1 ingredient, sugar. Fat is the other big problem, and here you see the consumption of soy oil. Soy oil is a potent inflammatory oil. It causes inflammation in the body. It causes cancer growth. I would challenge you to go into any supermarket, including Whole Foods, and find a processed food that doesn't have soy oil in it. It's loaded with soy oil. Soy oil is very stable. And it is dirt cheap because there's a subsidy from the agro tax, and that's a whole other issue that is going to make our battle here a challenge. But this is in absolutely everything. And there's healthy oils that are loaded with omega-3s, and they do the opposite. They decrease inflammation. They promote healthy cell growth. So we're being exposed to all of this. And so this is a study that David found that essentially demonstrates the change over time between this delicate balance of these 2 essential fatty acids, omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, that we have to have. So omega-6 is getting this bad rap, but we need it. We need it to stay alive, and we need omega-3 to stay alive. And the only way to get those fatty acids is from what we put on our plate. They're not natural in our body, and we can't survive without them. And we can see over millennia the balance, and this is from looking at historical records of bones that have been discovered, that this balance has been fairly consistent until recently. And of course, saturated fat is gone through the roof. But the analogy that David uses is that with a lawnmower or the 2-stroke engine, you have to have the proper balance of oil and gas for it to run properly. We have to have the proper balance of omega-6 and omega-3 to run properly. And we can't, because our food industry has manipulated the food to such a degree that there's no 3s and they're loaded with 6. I don't have details to get into all the examples, but they're in the book. And it's very hard to eat healthfully, even if we go out of our way. This, of course, you're all aware of. Being in Southern California, and it's not as much of a problem, of course, as coming from Texas. And you're going to see that in these slides that I'm about to show you. But California is, of course, not immune to this. These are obesity trends in the United States dating back to 1985, and I believe it takes us through 2009, I think, is the most recent data that's been published. And so the darkest blue color there represents 10 to 14% being obese in that state. And obese here isn't just being a little heavy. Obese is, as it shows up there, an example is being 30 pounds overweight for somebody who's 5'4". So this is really quite morbidly obese. And you can see here, over time, that in 1991 we need to add a new category, which is 15 to 20% of that state being obese. And now a new category which represents 20% being obese. 2001, another state falls and it's greater than 25%. More than a quarter of the people in that state are obese. Another category needs to be added in 2005. Greater than 30% of that state is obese. This is an epidemic in our society. We know the relationship between obesity and cardiovascular disease. The relationship is clear for diabetes, and now the relationship is becoming quite clear for many cancers. California is still, as you can see, not orange or dark red yet, but it's just a matter of time. Colorado being the only holdouts who are staying under 20%. Now, this is, again, obesity. It's not taking into account being overweight. So even of our own faculty and staff at MD Anderson, 65% are overweight or obese. And that's the statistic for the nation as a whole. Essentially, 3/4 of our nation is obese or overweight. This is a serious problem. So let's talk about something positive and something that was represented in some of the food that we ate this evening, in particular the fruits and the vegetables. There are so many powerful phytochemicals and nutrients in the food that is on our planet. And there's some examples that you can see up here. We won't go through them all, but here's turmeric, which David mentioned. Turmeric comes from Ayurvedic medicine. It's used as part of Indian cooking. It's a yellowing agent that's actually used in mustard and many other products that are on our supermarket shelves. It is a very potent anti-inflammatory spice. You see other things up here like ginger, grapes, so resveratrol. The red wine that we're drinking tonight has medicinal benefits in it. And of course the cruciferous vegetables, the cabbage family, the broccoli family, etc. Lycopene is loaded. Tomatoes are loaded with lycopene, which is believed to be an anti-prostate cancer product. This comes from one of the top research labs in Canada, where this scientist was focusing his laboratory on doing conventional studies of development of drugs, these toxic drugs, and he read a study showing that green tea could be useful in the fight against cancer, and they thought, well, if green tea could be useful, maybe there's other things out there that could be useful. And so he went out, he is literally a $40–50 million lab, all this fancy equipment. He went and he bought a $50 juicer, and he started juicing these different vegetables and fruits that are out there and putting them on cancer cells. So this is, of course, the first step in drug discovery when you look at it as it's called in vitro, where you have cancer cells in a petri dish and you would drop different things on them. And as you can see here, not everything was useful. Down at the bottom, cucumbers, red pepper, endive. This is specifically for inhibiting colon cancer growth. So it's not that you put anything on the cancer cells and it would kill them. But certain things, and again at the top is garlic and scallions, leek, Brussels sprouts, the cruciferous vegetables, as I mentioned. Something else that's very important to know is that there's synergy between these things. This is a graph looking at the antioxidant capacity of these common fruits. So we have apples, blueberries, grapes, and oranges. And we all know that blueberries have the highest antioxidant capacity, and that's reinforced with this graph. But the line that's the highest, dramatically higher, is the combination of all four of them together. So there's something going on when you mix these things together, and of course we don't eat foods in isolation until we get to the United States of America, where we isolate the blueberry, put it in a pill, and take that pill on its own and think that somehow that's going to be better than eating the blueberry, the apple, or the grape together. And so the synergy is something that becomes very important. Here's the risk of breast cancer in China based on whether women don't consume any medicinal mushrooms and they don't drink green tea versus consuming medicinal mushrooms, you can see a huge reduction. But if they're regular consumers of medicinal mushrooms and green tea, their risk of cancer goes down by 89%. So there's synergy, again, that's going on with these foods. This is David's depiction of the anti-cancer plate. As he mentioned, the recommendation, if you are to have animal protein, the best source, of course, is to get it from fish, because then you get the positive omega-3s. It's very hard to get omega-3s from food in our society, from land animals, unless they're eating grass and the appropriate kind of grains. Cows typically don't eat grass in our country, so their meat has almost no omega-3. So if you're going to eat beef, and there's nothing wrong with eating beef, make sure that it's grass-fed beef, and it's possible to get grass-fed beef now. And make sure it's also grass-finished. There's a little trick that the industry is doing, which is they can eat grass up until the last month of their life, then they load them up with soy and corn, make the cow fat, and the omega-3 in their body goes down, the omega-6 goes up. So it has to be grass-fed, grass-finished. There's lots of supermarkets I know in Southern California that serve grass-fed beef. The majority of the plate, however, is full of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. In our diet, of course, in North America, we have mastered the antithesis of the anti-cancer plate. We have created what one could argue is a carcinogenic plate. And so what have we exported to the rest of the world? What food are we known for? Hamburger, McDonald's. Of course, you know, there's other fast foods, but McDonald's is probably the biggest thing that we've been able to export to the world. So you look at the hamburger. The hamburger, of course, is a beef patty, and now it's a beef patty that's loaded with omega-6 fatty acid, a pure inflammatory agent. It's put in a white bun, which is essentially like pouring sugar into the body, a huge spike in glycemic load. And then what do we put on it? Ketchup. What's ketchup? It's essentially sugar. So then you've loaded more sugar onto it, and the side dish is probably the only vegetable that doesn't have any useful anti-cancer properties, and that's the white potato. And to add insult, we of course deep fry it to make it carcinogenic. And this is the American diet. This is what so many people consume on a regular basis. And of course that could be made healthy. You could eat a whole wheat bun, and you could eat grass-fed beef, and you could have baked, as we can see on this phenomenal poem, baked sweet potato instead of French fry. And so as David says, every time that you're going to make a choice of what to eat, you can choose to eat a food that is unhealthy and cancer-causing, or you can eat a neutral food, which there's nothing wrong with that, or you can make the choice to eat a purely anti-cancer food. And the anti-cancer foods are so delicious. And David outlines a lot of these in his book, and he's working on a cookbook that's sure to be phenomenal. So let's talk a little bit about physical activity. These are survival curves after colon cancer based on people's level of physical activity. The people on the graph who lived the longest, the lower bar, were the most physically active. And the other two groups weren't as physically active. This is after somebody already has their disease. Similar graph for breast cancer. And extreme physical activity actually didn't result in as good as moderate. So we're talking about moderate physical activity. Moderate physical activity, the recommendation now is, unfortunately for those who aren't physically active yet, it may seem a little daunting, 45 minutes a day, 6 days a week of moderate physical activity. Now, you don't start there. If you're not being physically active now, you could start at 20 minutes a day, 3 days a week, and slowly work your way up. But 50% reduction in recurrence of cancer by just being moderately physically active. What fits your busy schedule better, exercising 1 hour a day or being dead 24 hours a day? We know there's actually a relationship now between physical activity and cognitive functioning, and the true link with Alzheimer's hasn't been made, but people who exercise regularly have increased oxygenation of the brain, and the slow loss of memory that is inevitable in all of us, even if it's not Alzheimer's, can be delayed with physical activity. So the last area I'm going to talk about is stress. And there is the belief out there that stress actually causes cancer. And there's so much evidence out there on the negative relationship between stress and our biological system, even down right into our cells. Every cell in our body, you all know from biology in high school, has chromosomes in them. And at the end of every chromosome, which you may not have learned in high school biology, is something called a telomere. And as we age, our telomeres shrink. If you're chronically stressed, your telomeres shrink. The enzyme that's in every cell to protect your telomeres goes down when you're chronically stressed. And phenomenal studies that have been done comparing people who are chronically stressed versus those who are not estimated that people are losing 10 years of life if they're a caregiver for an Alzheimer's patient or a caregiver for a child with cancer due to the difficulty in the stress. So the concept that stress could increase your risk of cancer and be an etiological factor is on our consciousness because of these links. But there hasn't been a good link. And part of the challenge is, what is stress? How do you measure stress? No two people respond the exact same way to stress. There is such heterogeneity of the resources that people have. Now, what we know is, again, that stress is not stress. This is an old study that was done back in the 80s, but published in the journal Science. The journal Science is the #1 journal in the world. And they published this truly landmark study. And I'll describe it because I believe it is so important, and why David, when you heard him speak, used the word helplessness and hopelessness. What we see here is a standard conditioning paradigm with these rats who are bred to develop cancer. And the first bar is the tumor rejection rate, so the ability of that rat to reject the tumor naturally. And so naturally, about 54% of these rats are going to be able to reject their tumor. Again, highlighting the fact that there's anti-cancer physiology in all organisms naturally. The second bar represents the ability of this rat to reject the tumor when he's exposed to uncontrolled electric shocks. The shocks are coming at a variable time. They can't predict when they're coming. And you can see only 23% are able to reject the tumors. The third bar represents animals who have the exact same amount of shock, but they can actually control when it goes off. So those two animals are yoked together, so the exact same amount of shock. So therefore, the exact same amount of stress, but the animal can control it. They can actually reject tumors at a higher rate than if they weren't even shocked at all. So it has to do with this concept of being in control of what's going on in our lives, where it's possible. This comes from MD Anderson, again published in one of the top medical journals, my colleague who works specifically with ovarian cancer, and he's developed this very simplistic psychological stress model. That previous example represents both psychological stress and the physical effects of stress. And Dr. Sood's developed a psychological stress model, which is restraint stress, which really freaks the animals out, but it doesn't harm them in any way. And the first two bars of each graph represent an animal not stressed, and then the second one represents the animal's stress. These tumors grow dramatically faster, dramatically larger. You can see the spread throughout the body, the tumor nodules on the right. And what he was able to show is that if the animals were given propranolol, which we see on this graph here, propranolol is a beta blocker. Propranolol blocks the stress hormone norepinephrine. when the animals had norepinephrine blocked in their body, they did not have a growth of their cancer. It was as if they weren't stressed at all. So we know the biology behind why stress could play a role, in particular once you have cancer. People who respond to cancer with depression, and most recently people who actually have an increase in depression over the course of a year don't live as long. We can treat depression, but depression in most cancer centers is totally ignored. The whole psychological side of cancer is totally ignored. And we are devoid in managing that area at MD Anderson, unfortunately, at the moment, and we're working very hard to change that. But we have 3 psychiatrists at MD Anderson, and we have a growth in this area. But currently we have 3 psychiatrists, and we have a search for a chair and to have a lot more psychiatrists join the group. But we treat over 30,000 breast cancer patients, 30,000 cancer patients every year. 30,000 new cancer patients. Even if we had 10 psychiatrists, 20 psychiatrists, we're going to barely be able to touch the issues to try and help people manage the emotional side of the disease. So what I've gone over today and what's outlined in the book are promoters of cancer, and then of course the inhibitors of cancer. Our society, not only are these promoters of cancer, but our society promotes these things on the left side of this graph. These are things that we're exporting to other countries of the world. The #1 cancer for women in Mumbai, India, is breast cancer. This is a new phenomenon. It never used to be the case. There's an increase in fast food, there's an increase in obesity, there's an increase in sedentary behavior, and there's an increase in chronic stress. So we also know the data behind all these inhibitors of cancer. And the challenge in this area of research is that there has been funding to look at diet. And this is an example of research that looked at diet. Millions of dollars were invested in this study to get women who were diagnosed with breast cancer to eat 9 fruits and vegetables a day. The control group were told the standard recommendation of 5 fruits and vegetables a day. And so the women actually were able to increase fruit and vegetable intake, and there was a modest benefit, but not anywhere near the degree that the investigators were hoping. And they went and they looked at the data, and this is probably one of the most important graphs that I'm going to be showing you tonight. Because what they did is they, not only did they assess what people were eating, but they also, on the side, looked at physical activity. And so the gray bar that you see up there, the gray line, this is survival after the diagnosis of breast cancer and joining the study. The gray line represents people who didn't increase fruit and vegetable consumption and didn't change their physical activity. The yellow line represents people who increased fruit and vegetable consumption, didn't change physical activity, and those lines are almost identical. So when a physician is asked by a breast cancer patient at the end of treatment, well, now what should I do? Should I increase fruit and vegetable consumption? I'd say, well, no. You know, the data is not that supportive. Eat your 5 a day, and but you know, don't go out of your way. The data is not there. The next one is people who didn't change fruit and vegetable consumption but increased their physical activity. Maybe early you see some semblance of a change, but by 5-6 years the lines are intertwined again. The blue line is women who increase fruit and vegetable consumption and increase their physical activity. This is an example in science that we call synergy, that the addition of the two is substantially more than either one on their own. And in this case, it bumps the curve dramatically. Those women live significantly longer. Now in science, what we do, unfortunately, is something called reductionistic medicine, where we manipulate one thing. We manipulate one thing in the experiment so that we can know that it's that thing that made the difference between the outcome between the experimental group and the control group. And so there hasn't been research funded to date that is actually, absurd as it may sound to all of you. Let's look at physical activity and exercise. Perhaps that's going to give us a better outcome than either one alone. This research is now just starting to be funded. This is a relatively recent article published in a top medical journal looking at overall survival, just the relative risk of death based on just some common healthful behaviors, not excessively drinking, not smoking, being physically active. Fourth one, I can't remember. But you can see that there's synergy going on here. If you don't do anything, your relative risk of death, as it's done statistically in this study, is 4 times higher than the group that implemented all the behaviors. And by adding each healthful behavior, your risk of death goes down substantially. So it's this addition that is the key. So this is Dr. Mendelsohn, who's the president of MD Anderson, who I mentioned to you briefly at the beginning. Back in November, every year he does a State of the Institution address and outlines the areas for growth at MD Anderson in the areas of clinical care and research and prevention. And this is a quote that really, really blew my mind. And I'll read it to you for those at the back who can't see it. And this was within the area of expansion for clinical care. A third area of expanded services for cancer patients and for people seeking improved health focuses on the broad topic of behavior, lifestyle, and personal fulfillment. I didn't choose that word, personal fulfillment, for him. And it's a phenomenal choice of word, because people who have fulfillment in life, who find meaning in life, actually live longer. Research findings are beginning to make it clear that optimizing these aspects of one life can have impact on the incidence of cancer and on the outcomes for patients who are receiving treatment for cancer. This is the president of the most conventional Western cancer center, and he's saying this sort of statement. He says this often, would love to have been here tonight. He was actually in Davos, Switzerland at the World Economic Summit the past few days. I want all patients seen by a surgical oncologist, medical oncologist, radiation oncologist, and integrative oncologist. A healthcare professional who can advise patients on lifestyle and behavior change in the areas of diet, herbs and supplements, physical activity, and stress management practices, and social support to improve quality of life and clinical outcomes. It's my goal to add this fourth professional to the team that evaluates each patient at MD Anderson. Today, this is paid for inadequately, so we must do research to prove its value. And that, of course, is why we're here today, to try and raise the necessary funds to do this study. So we had a very generous family from New Mexico who donated $1 million to this study. And when they came and they did a site visit to meet us and to hear what we were all about, and I described what we're doing and what the evidence is on diet and physical activity, she kind of scratched her head and said, well, isn't it obvious? I mean, you just presented the most compelling case. David presents the most compelling case. John Mendelsohn, when he read David's book, said, this is the next frontier for cancer medicine, to look at lifestyle. So why do we have to do a study? When we assess our own breast cancer patients at MD Anderson, the obese ones don't live as long. The obese ones don't respond to their chemotherapy. I mean, why bother, in some sense, giving somebody chemotherapy if they're going to continue to lead a lifestyle that fuels their cancer? I don't have a slide for this, but Dean Ornish, and those of you who don't know Dean Ornish, I'd recommend you also take a look at his book called The Spectrum. He has this wonderful cartoon that has these doctors in the operating room who are mopping up water on the floor, and you look over to the corner and the sink is overflowing and the faucets are on. And they're mopping up the floor. Nobody's turning off the faucet. Nobody is stopping the fuel to the fire that is brewing, which is called cancer. And so our objective in this study is, as it says here, to dramatically move the integrative medicine field forward through several groundbreaking strategies that are going to be part of this study that will have an impact, of course, on quality of life, but physical outcomes and biological indices of inflammation. So what we're going to be designing is somewhat different than the few comprehensive studies that are out there, because we have to do it in a cost-effective manner. We can't assign to everybody a coach and a cook to come and live with them, which is what some of Dean Ornish's work has gone to an extreme to show the proof of principle, and he was able to show you can reverse heart disease with lifestyle. So we're going to design something that is going to be cost-effective, that will be standardized. We're going to harness the power of the internet and communication through the internet to be able to reach more people than who can just come into the medical center. We're going to, our biggest challenge is getting people to maintain these healthy behaviors that we've been outlining. And so working through the internet, working with coaches, and very importantly, working with the whole family, working with the spouse. This is an intervention that has to change, ultimately, the whole household. If you are a lung cancer patient and you quit smoking, but everyone in the house is still smoking, this is going to be a problem to remain smoke-free yourself. And again, as I mentioned, we have to examine the cost-effectiveness of this. And Dean Ornish is actually showing in his heart-based intervention research that it is quite cost-effective, and he's been approved in 3 states to have Medicare, Medicaid reimburse for his lifestyle diet for the prevention of heart disease. And now we need to prove the same kind of thing in cancer. So essentially what we'll be doing is developing the comprehensive, novel, standardized, web-based intervention that is going to focus on diet, physical activity, stress management, and social support. And we're going to be measuring essentially everything under the sun from these individuals. So we're not just going to look at recurrence of disease, but we're going to be taking blood and looking at all the tumor-related pathways, looking at insulin-related pathways, looking at all the things that the basic scientists and the conventional scientists are looking at in terms of drug discovery, to be able to show if this works, not only that it works, but why it works, and truly understanding the science. The head of breast medical oncology at MD Anderson is a leader in the field, the former president of the American Society for Clinical Oncology. And when I asked him, don't we have enough evidence that we should be having dietitians and physical therapists on staff and that no one leave the clinic without a proper education, his response is, there hasn't been a clinical trial done to definitively show that if you modify the risk factor, you modify outcome. Again, I know that sounds absurd, but we have to do this kind of clinical trial in a well-controlled fashion. And so this first study, it was very hard to pick the population, partly because there's so many cancers that we know are going to be vulnerable to lifestyle factors in terms of continuing the risk after you're diagnosed. And in particular, ovarian cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, and breast cancer, which of course are some of the top cancers that are afflicting our society today, these Western-based lifestyle cancers. And the other reason it was difficult is because all of my colleagues in those different departments wanted me to pick their cancer. So the colon folks were saying, no, you have to pick colon, and this is why, and this is how we'll do it, and the breast folks. But we zeroed in on breast cancer, partly because of the numbers and the ability to pull off this kind of study at a single institution, and partly because of a very frightening statistic that my colleagues shared with me, which is that women who unfortunately are diagnosed with advanced disease, in particular stage 3, they have to, of course, undergo chemotherapy first, and then surgery, and then radiotherapy. And then they leave the hospital typically with a pat on the back saying, oh, don't worry about diet or physical activity, we'll just do screening on a regular basis, and if it comes back, then we'll catch it early. They also leave the hospital knowing that 50% chance in 2 years they're going to have a recurrence. So half of them will have a recurrence in that first 2 years. This is a horrendous statistic. And many women leave the hospital with nothing to take. And so they also have fear. So 3/4 of the women will leave the hospital taking a hormonal blocker, or something called Herceptin, which blocks a particular oncogene in the body, but only a quarter of the women will leave with nothing. So we're going to enrich our population to have what's called half triple negatives, so these women who have actually a worse prognosis. And there's been evidence to show, even just from psychological interventions, that just having a psychological intervention changed life expectancy of women who are in this category of triple negative. So we hope by starting with this population that they're also a very motivated population, and are going to be willing to participate in the rigorous lifestyle changes that we'll be prescribing. So I want to end now because I know there may be some questions, and I know that there's a band that's going to fire it up again. But I'll close now, and again, thank you all for coming and for the support and the warmth that I feel in this room to these wonderful individuals who have put this on. There's tremendous love in this room, and I know you'll come together to help this landmark study and change the way we treat cancer patients in this country and around the world. Thank you.